Well, hey, everybody. It's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to August. Hope you're all doing well, wherever you may be at. We are going to get underway in just a quick minute, and you know you're in the right place if you are here to have a conversation about bridging and understanding a little bit more about the political moment that we might be in and how to be most effective in communicating at a time when we feel very polarized as a society. But before we do any of that, thank you for making some time to join us. We're going to start with this thing that we've borrowed from Professor Brene Brown down at the University of Houston there in Texas. And that is this idea of a two-word check-in. And it works like this, kind of says it on your screen here. Type in your name. You're going to go into that box. You're already doing it, Jennifer and Julia, where you're at, and then in just 2 words, how you doing? So I'm going to model it for you, but Jennifer and Julia are already ahead of me, and then everybody go ahead and jump in. Let's see, Claire, how are you doing? Robert, Marika, nice to see you, my friend. Trishanda, nice to see you. Who else is with us? Grace, Roger, Matt, Becky, Jackie. Okay, now it's starting to go just a little too fast for me. Amber, nice to see you. Jennifer. Suffice to say, gang, if you see folks you know, and chances are you do, say hello to one another. You can direct message them or y'all can chit chat. We will be putting some links in this chat along the way. Hey, Aaron in Pittsburgh. Let's keep going, gang. So why don't we, my partner in crime, Kareem and Tristan, if you would, go ahead and let's take us forward. A couple little pieces of housekeeping for you as we get everybody into the room here. First thing here is Slack. So chances are, if you're a network member, you know this, but there's almost, and this is hard to believe, almost 2,400 of us in this Slack channel where we're helping each other out. We're asking questions, introducing each other, sharing resources, all that kind of great, wonderful stuff. It's only available if you're a network member, but it is an incredible resource, and so highly recommend that if that's something of interest to you, because it's really helpful. None of us should have to go it alone. With that, Mr. K, if you would, let's take us forward. This video is going to play, and while it does, I'm going to talk to you. You can just kind of follow along with both. We launched a program back in the middle of the pandemic called Circles, and it was because the network had gotten so big, we decided the best way for you to find the most helpful people to you was to shrink the space. And that was to create places based on the job you do, maybe the issues that you work on, or maybe an identity that you share. And as you can see here, they gather all the time on Slack. They have dedicated channels. They meet up at ComNet. And then once a month, we manage a regular video meeting for everybody. That's Circles. Again, network members have an option to join any one of those. Highly recommend that. Let's go forward. We also have local groups gathering around the country. And this is a pretty cool idea, and it's a pretty simple idea. You know, sometimes you just need to borrow a cup of sugar, and you ain't going to go from Seattle to Miami to do that. But getting to know the folks who live in your backyard is a great way to ensure that you can avail yourself of local resources, problem solve, and just have a couple of shoulders to cry on or bounce ideas off of, all that good stuff. And as soon as this video wraps up, we have 13 cities now that are actually maybe 14. I take that back, 14 that are gathering around the country, including a new group that just launched in North Carolina, and they're going to be gathering in just a couple of weeks' time, actually even less than a couple of weeks' time, if I'm remembering. So popping up here, here's a couple things happening around the country. These are free and open to all, so you don't have to be a network member, but if you're in DC, you're in Chicago, you're in North Carolina, or maybe down there in Miami, please take advantage. It's an opportunity to go hang out with some of the other folks working in comms for good in your backyard. And you can see links that Tristan is tossing in here. So you can go ahead and register and get signed up for those things. I'm especially excited. Our DC folks are getting together. They're going to watch the Nationals play the Orioles. So that little, I guess, what is that? The BW Parkway series or something? Suffice to say, that's going to be happening and super fun. All right, let's move ahead. I think we got one more. A little bit of bad news for those of you. Happens every year. If you got your ticket for ComNet, we are so excited to welcome you. There'll be about 1,000 of us gathering in Kansas City in October, including some of the folks here on this webinar, if I'm not mistaken. But we are now sold out. So we've got a wait list. The good news is every year we're able to, and Tristan was just kind enough to toss that in there. You can add your name there. Every year we're able to offer some folks some spaces in off the wait list. Typically we have a few cancellations and such. So if that's something that of interest to you, you weren't able to get into the conference, add your name to the wait list. We will do our very best to get as many folks in off the wait list as we can. And with that, I think I'm done. So let's see. Yes, I am. So I'm going to pass it over to Phoebe. This is going to be, I had a chance to sit in on the practice session, gang. I can tell you we are in for a huge treat. There's a lot of really rich, good data coming from Carolyn, Julia, and Paul, but we're going to kick things off with Phoebe Meyer. She's back with us. If you remember, she was with us before. She's fantastic. And so with that, I'm going to stop my yakking at you. Oh, wait a minute. Before I do want to say thank you to Derek. He's offering ASL services. So you'll see him tacked up there. If you have need, go ahead and keep him dialed in. You can also add, as you all probably know, closed captioning down at the bottom there. So just click that if you should have need. You'll get a not quite perfect, but pretty good captioning service available to you. All right, with that, let's get underway. And then at the back end of this, the other thing I need to tell you is we will make some time for office hours. So if you want to join us and have specific questions for any of these lovely folks, please make a little bit of time. We will share a link so you can join us. It'll be a separate Zoom meeting where you'll be on camera and have a chance to ask direct questions. Okay, now I'm actually going to shut up. With that, Phoebe, over to you, my friend, and I'll see you all on the other side.
Thank you, Sean, for that warm welcome. My name is Phoebe Meyer, and I'm the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at the Center for Christianity and Public Life, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., with the mission to contend for the credibility of Christian resources in public life for the public good. Really grateful today to be joined by my friends from More in Common and Nieman Collaborative to host this session on depolarization and bridge building. Next slide. Today, we're going to take you on a journey to explore new data to help us understand the divides in the United States, divides that we are all probably feeling pretty deeply and perhaps especially over the last month's news cycle. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today. We'll start out with some table setting on the goals and intention for this webinar. We're going to dig into some research by More in Common to understand the particular kind of polarization we are seeing in the United States. And from there, we'll talk about what we can learn from the bridge building field to engage with our present moment. More in Common is going to share new research they did on trusted messengers and the public's views on philanthropy. And to close, we'll hear 2 case studies from Nieman Collaborative that bring the framework on bridge building and insights from More in Common all together in practical data-backed impact strategies. Next slide. Our goals are that you would understand what makes this moment in history unique and how to navigate polarization in an election season, that you would be equipped to address political polarization through your foundation or nonprofit organization's communications, and that you would learn key communications tactics and strategies for gaining support from new or reluctant audiences. I want to start with a question and actually hear from you all first. You can scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter those numbers in. And would love to know what issues are polarizing your community or workplace right now. What are the things that you are feeling like are dividing your community, are causing the most tension, the conversations that you're finding the hardest to navigate? I'm hoping that this will make us all feel a little less alone as we are entering into these difficult conversations. Yep. Israel and Gaza, gender issues. I see gender issues a couple of times, the election, immigration and the border, affordable housing, climate change, racism and DEI conversations. Yeah. Christian nationalism, yep. Yes. So big, deep breath. These are a lot of difficult issues, and we are all feeling the impact of polarization on our families, our neighborhoods, and our workplaces. You can go to the next slide. Thank you all for sharing those. I think one of the questions that I've been asking and that I've been hearing a lot of people ask is, are we more polarized now than we ever have been? And I think that's potentially a rabbit hole that we could get dragged down. And instead, I would suggest that it's helpful instead to ask, what is the particular kind of polarization that we are facing today? Some polarization is good. It is neutral. It can be strategic. Good conflict is a benefit to society, and differences in opinion are needed in a healthy democracy. So we want to encourage that. But it's when polarization becomes weaponized that it becomes toxic. And this is what we want to protect ourselves against and counter. So to help us understand what kind of polarization we are seeing here in the US, I'm going to pass it off to Paul at More in Common.
Awesome. Thank you, Phoebe. And I'm Paul. I'm a research associate at More in Common. And we can go ahead and actually we can stop on this slide, but I just want to talk about how I've set up this presentation. I want to focus on three different parts. First, exploring if, as Phoebe was mentioning, are we divided in America over politics? And, what is the evidence that we're divided? Second, are there reasons to be hopeful, and also steps that we can take both as individuals and as organizations to navigate polarization and look for solutions? And finally, I want to kind of talk about the current political moment, if polarization is getting worse, especially in this contentious election season. I'm going to also share some survey data we fielded just in the last month on how Americans are feeling in this current political moment. So we can go to the next slide. And just for those of you who may not know our organization, More in Common is an organization that works on the many facets of social cohesion and polarization. We bring a lens to the world which is based on understanding audiences through the prism of their values and their psychology, and less so their political identity as a Democrat or Republican. We also look at multiple issues to try and break silos, recognizing that few people look at the world through the lens of a single issue. And we also have a focus on helping our partners navigate change. We're a group of about 35 people working in six different countries in Europe, in the US, and Brazil. And we've released a lot of different reports on specific issues around polarization, such as history and education and our identities as Americans. We can go to the next slide. So I want to answer the first question in this presentation, which is that Americans are divided, and this probably comes as no surprise to anyone. We know from our research that most Americans feel extremely divided. In our survey work, the most common word to describe our country these days by Americans is divided. We go to the next slide. And there is real evidence for this. There's real polarization that has taken place in the past 2 decades. So this graph is showing where Democrats and Republicans overlap on certain political values. And what we see here from research is that we have less conservative Democrats and less liberal Republicans. And we call this sorting in political science. And this in part explains how Americans have really become more polarized and specifically uniform in our views as groups. We can go to the next slide. One of the other major developments over time is what the political scientist Liliana Mason calls mega identities. And this is the idea that Democrats and Republicans have become much more homogenous in their identities. And what that means is, for example, Republicans are more likely to share a similar religion or live in the same region, eat at the same restaurants, shop at the same stores, and often just share similar cultural experiences. And the same is true for Republicans, Democrats and Republicans both. We've become separated in our identities, our culture, our newsfeed, and quite honestly, our realities. We can go to the next slide. We also know that conflict entrepreneurs are incentivized to stoke division between these parties. These media figures and elected officials use hyperbole, extreme language, and existential threat to incite often unfounded fear in audiences. We know that these conflict entrepreneurs are present in media and on both sides of the aisle. And Dave Isay, who's the founder of a great organization, StoryCorps, calls this the hate industrial complex, which is a billion-dollar industry that feeds off fear and hatred of those who do not belong to your preferred group. We also know that systems like social media algorithms enable more emotional or extreme content, and the people who post and engage on these platforms are often not representative of most Americans. And we see real downstream effects of this national landscape, especially in election years, that favor contempt and hatred of the other side. And one way to measure this is through what we call affective polarization, which is the negative feelings that Americans hold towards those who are not in their political group. We see here in this graph that about 9 in 10 Democrats and 9 in 10 Republicans describe the other side as brainwashed and hateful. They're much less likely to use words like honest, caring, or reasonable to describe those in the other party. And the consequences of our national discourse in the media and from elected officials play out in our views in the other side. And again, this is coming from both political parties at similarly high levels. Go to the next slide. We also know that these feelings on the previous slide of hostility have worsened. This shows average feelings of favorability over time among Democrats and Republicans towards each other. And Americans in the past have mostly felt neutral towards those in the other party, but in our current moment, most Americans feel significantly negatively towards those in the other party. And this is our political reality at the moment. It's a lack of trust and warmth towards others who do not share our political beliefs, a culture of fear and outrage in many of the media and social media we see, and a separate cultural experience as well as identities and realities. So we can go to the next slide. And I hope I have not scared you too much because there are real reasons to be hopeful in this current moment. We can go to the next slide. First, we know from our research that Americans don't fit neatly into Republican and Democrat categories. In fact, in our research we call hidden tribes, we find that core beliefs in psychology are better predictors of Americans' views on politics than the traditional binary categories that we use. And instead, we see that Americans' views are not bucketed into just two groups, but much more nuanced and sometimes not fully formed. For example, we know that the largest segment in our grouping is what we call the politically disengaged. That's a group of Americans who are not very interested in politics. They're detached from political news. They care more about their families and sports and honestly anything other than politics. And part of this segmentation also includes a grouping at the bottom of the chart, if you look there, and we call it the exhausted majority. It's a group of Americans who are exhausted by division and open to compromise. And we know that this actually represents most Americans, 67%. We also have groups in what we call the wings on each side, progressive activists and traditional and devoted conservatives. These groups represent about a third of Americans who are more extreme in their political beliefs and less open to compromise. And go to the next slide. And we know that these two groups, the exhausted majority and the wings, experience politics very differently. If you look at the table in green, you can see that the exhausted majority is more frustrated with America. They're not strongly partisan and they want their side to listen more. But we know from our research that the wings still define the political space. If you look at that table in orange, you can see that the wing groups are the ones that more closely follow politics. They post more about politics on social media and they vote more often. We know that social media is often represented by more politically extreme Americans like those of the wings, who often dominate the conversations and again are more likely to post political content. And this type of gap between groups that are defining the political discourse and the views of most Americans is to blame for something we call a perception gap. We can go to the next slide. And this is the concept. It's the difference between what one group thinks another group believes and what the other group actually believes. For example, let's say Republicans estimate that 30% of Democrats are proud to be American. But in reality, 70% of Democrats are proud to be American. And that's a perception gap and a quite large one. So I have a few examples of this here. And on the top chart, we have an example of a real perception gap. So the top graph shows the actual views of Republicans as the red dot on the statement on the left. And the blue dot is what Democrats estimate to be the views for Republicans. So what do we see here? We asked Republicans if they agree with the statement, Americans have a responsibility to learn from our past and fix our mistakes. And 93% agreed. Yet when we asked Democrats what percentage of Republicans they thought would agree with this statement, they said on average just 35% of Republicans. And we see a similar pattern at the bottom. We tested the statement, all students should learn about how the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution advance freedom and equality. And most Democrats, 92%, agree with that statement. However, Republicans think less than half of Democrats, 45%, would agree. And we've done research in the past that has found these perception gaps on all sorts of topics. A lot of the topics that I saw pop up on the Slido graph of polarizing topics, from immigration to policing, we found that both sides think the other side's views are much more extreme than they actually are. And this to us presents a concerning level of misunderstanding, but a huge and real reason for hope. Americans are much more aligned on issues than we like to think. We can go to the next slide. In connecting back to our hidden tribe segments, we find that the more extreme you are in your political beliefs, the higher your perception gaps. So this graph shows the size of the perception gaps by those hidden tribe groups. And in fact, the Americans who don't follow politics closely, those who don't watch political media or post political content, the politically disengaged, actually have the lowest perception gap. They're the best at understanding the views of those not in their political group. Go to the next slide. We also find that these perception gaps have real-world consequences. The larger they are, the more likely we are to attribute negative characteristics to our political opponent. So these graphs show a correlation between someone's perception gap and their use of negative qualities to describe their political opponent. And I think just to kind of close this section, as an organization, we're really focused on finding ways to close these perception gaps as they show how Americans don't understand the views of their opponents and actually have much more common ground than they like to think. Go to the next slide. So I want to kind of finally end here with a few slides on where we are in this current election season and if polarization is getting worse. And obviously, we're in a tumultuous election already with the attempted assassination of Trump and President Biden stepping down. But what this current moment can be best described as is ossification. Our research indicates that perception gaps have not gotten worse in the past few years, but remain high, and negative feelings towards the other side in the past few years have not moved much. In a sense, we're kind of stuck as Americans in a polarizing moment that has characterized our politics for the past few years. Go to the next slide. Just quickly as context, we have a panel of Americans representative of the country. We ask questions to them and hear quotes, and we ask them what they expect in this election season. Most Americans are scared and concerned. So Eason at the bottom, a Democrat, says, "I expect it to be as divisive or even more divisive, unfortunately." Some also think we're in peak polarization. So Gamble at the top says, "I don't see how elections can be anything other than divisive going forward." So in short, Americans really are expecting deep division in our election come up. We go to the next slide. And from a recent larger quantitative survey we fielded last month, we found that most Americans, 71%, think that we will see more civil violence in the next year. And this is true across political parties. Americans are concerned about political violence. Go to the next slide. However, we know from our research that actual support for political violence is very low. Here we asked Americans if certain actions were justified in the context of the 2024 election cycle, such as peaceful protests, online and in-person confrontations of those they disagree with, and physical attacks against supporters of the other side. What we found was that Republicans overwhelmingly reject violence, 98%, rejecting kind of any sort of political violence against those in the other party. But connecting back to perception gaps, we see that Democrats think way more Republicans would condone this violence, 1 in 3. We also found on the other side that Democrats overwhelmingly reject physical violence, 99%. However, Republicans believe that almost 1 in 4 Democrats would condone violence against a Trump supporter. And just to kind of close, we know that these perception gaps matter. Studies have found that if we think the other side is willing to engage in political violence, we ourselves become more tolerant of violence. So correcting these perception gaps to us is critical for lowering the temperature. And as one of our participants, Adam, in our survey mentioned, he says, "I hope no matter who wins, we can figure out ways to come together as Americans." And I think this type of messaging and this sentiment is what we show and find receives broad support in our messaging, which my colleague Julia will speak about later. But first, I'm going to pass it back to Phoebe to share a little bit about the frameworks for bridge building.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate you ending on that hopeful note. There is indeed hope. The important thing is understanding how to capitalize on the hope. But first, a little bit of neuroscience. Next slide. A study done by psychologists at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles in 2016 scanned what happens in the brain when someone's political beliefs are challenged. They found that regions of the brain associated with personal identity, threat response, and emotions become activated. When produced with evidence that countered their political beliefs, people's amygdala, associated with fear, anxiety, and emotion, lit up. The brain basically goes into protection mode. And in talking about identity, I think it's important to note that the prevalence of social media and building platforms and creating personal brands has contributed to the way one aligns their identity with their opinions and political beliefs. The publicness and permanence of the internet makes it harder than ever to admit that you are wrong and to change your opinion. This affects both individuals and organizations. We feel this, we know this, so what do we do about it? In order to effectively challenge someone's views without triggering this emotional response, this kind of protection mode, we must get ahead of or moderate the fear response. Next slide. In collaboration with Manu Meal, who is the founder of Bridge USA, an organization that works to bridge divides on college campuses, I designed this simple tool to illustrate the goal of bridge building. Rather than move people along the x-axis towards the center politically, the goal of bridge building is to move people along the y-axis. The goal is that people would not become more hostile or volatile around their convictions, nor would they become disengaged or apathetic. Rather, bridge building work empowers individuals to come to the table with their full convictions, but with a spirit of empathy and understanding. In the last section, Paul shared research that indicates that hostility towards the other side has steadily worsened. And moving people toward the middle of the y-axis is a solution to this. Next slide. The end goal of bridge building is not more centrist. Bridge building does not ask people to dilute their political convictions or compromise their values, but bridge building efforts are intended to change temperament. We want to decrease volatility, move people from disengaged to active citizens and bridge builders, and create a moderated temperament. Bridge building efforts are focused on building civility towards whoever you might think the other is, and training participants to engage or co-create with someone or some group that they disagree with. Success is when people are engaging with each other with empathy and understanding. One way to go about doing this is by identifying and appealing to someone's values, even if they differ from your own. Next slide. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt proposed a model of moral foundations. He argues that human beings have 6 different areas of moral concern: care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and purity. In the United States context, he says that liberals operate from a system that places higher value on the first set of moral concern: care, fairness, and liberty, whereas conservative values come from an equal place of concern for all 6. No one of these moral concerns is any more important than the other. They are just different. And once we understand which value system someone is operating from, we can begin to understand the deeper roots of the political belief and the values attached to that belief. We can also begin to appeal to areas of common value. Next slide. I'm going to use paid family leave here as an example, just to kind of show how this might work. So when trying to appeal to liberals, we might appeal to fairness. For example, paid family leave can decrease the racial wealth gap by creating equitable policies so that parents can stay at home with their new children without it impacting their job stability or income. Versus with conservatives, we might appeal to the sanctity of family, saying something like paid family leave gives new mothers and fathers time to bond with their children, strengthening family stability and the lifelong social welfare of their children. Not saying that these are the only ways to go about this, just sharing a couple of examples to show how those values might come into play in terms of using language. Again, bridge building is not about changing someone's convictions. It's about decreasing volatility and hostility. We think people can read our minds because we know our own minds so well, but the reality is that people can't read our minds, nor can we read others. Next slide. In the wake of the 2016 and 2020 elections and growing concern over political polarization, many counter-polarization or depolarization efforts emerged on the national, regional, and local levels. Some are institutional, others are startups or local initiatives. A few years ago, I helped identify and categorize key organizations engaging in depolarization in the US to better understand how they work, including their theories of change, current use and experience of technology, and barriers to their work. Next slide. We began with 400 plus organizations based on the incredible research provided by Princeton's Bridging Divides initiative. Then we more closely reviewed and coded the tactics of 40 of these that fit different categories or the levers that they use to engage in depolarization. And then we did in-depth interviews with several of the organizations. And when we look across all of the different types of depolarization organizations that exist, their theories of change can be boiled down into 5 primary theories. These theories serve as helpful models for what this bridge building work can look like within nonprofits and institutions. Most organizations undertake activities that combine multiple theories of social change. Next slide. There are 5 primary theories of social change. So I'm going to do a flyover of these theories, and then if you want, we can go more in depth during the discussion time. The first is that presenting people with objective information depolarizes. For example, a nonprofit called Build Up uses bots to identify people engaged in political discussions about the United States on Twitter and Facebook. They analyze the likelihood that they are polarized, that those conversations are polarized, or they are becoming polarized based on the behavior of users. They use automation to engage with them and organize a network of trained conversation facilitators to follow up on automated contact. By doing this, they redirect polarizing conversations and provide objective information and new perspectives into what would otherwise be a heated dialogue. The second is that facilitating spaces, next slide, of listening and understanding across lines of difference, either one-on-one or in groups, depolarizes. Organizations like Bridge USA, who I mentioned earlier, or Resetting the Table, bring together people who have conversations around lines of difference, facilitating a shared understanding or common ground between participants. The third theory of change is that establishing shared interest and common ground demystifies the other. Next slide. Similar to listening to create understanding, this theory of change is rooted in the idea that once people establish a shared interest or area of common ground, like both caring deeply about what happens to their family members, it makes it much easier to have harder conversations. For example, in my current work context at the Center for Christianity and Public Life, we work with civic leaders who come from a variety of political, denominational, racial backgrounds, but they are unified in our cohort groups by their common shared personal faith. The fourth theory of social change is that co-creating or engaging in activities together fosters social cohesion. With co-creation tactics, the important thing is making sure that people from different groups have an equal seat at the table. For example, an initiative to bridge differences between 2 neighborhoods needs to have equal buy-in and shared collaboration between representatives from both neighborhoods. This is the work of co-creation. And finally, lifting up models of bridge building. Next slide. Sorry, can you go to the next slide? Lifting up models of bridge building through trusted messengers, stories, people, efforts that have trust and buy-in shapes behavior. To talk more about this, I'm going to pass it off to Julia from More in Common, who's going to talk about communication tactics.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Phoebe. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you or know that you're out there in the Zoom void. My name is Julia, and I'm a senior associate at More in Common. And today, building on what Paul and Phoebe shared, I'm really excited to share a few insights on how you can engage trusted messengers and mediums in your communication efforts to help bridge the divides. We can go to the next slide. So as we all know and are experiencing, we are living in an era of low trust. Less than 1 in 5 Americans trust national institutions like the federal government, corporations, or the media. So in this environment, we can't assume trust. It's something that we need to be actively earning. Next slide. So we asked 200 Americans who they'd trust to speak about bridging political divides. And honestly, many struggled, unfortunately, to name anyone. As Morty shared, in my opinion, there is no single person or group of people who could effectively bring people together across political divisions in the country. It's a sad commentary on the country. And we heard similar sentiments from many participants. Those who did name individuals mentioned figures from politicians to celebrities like The Rock and Oprah were both really popular, to family members, friends, football coaches, and pastors. But despite the variety in responses, a few common themes did emerge. You can go to the next slide. So first and foremost, people generally trust local community members more than national figures. So as Jalen described, I trust my local community leaders because they are level-headed, focused on relevant issues, and grounded in reality. More in Common recently conducted a regional study where we asked Americans who in their local community they trust the most. Across all 3 major cities in the study, we found that people most trust their family and friends, which is fairly intuitive, as well as doctors, colleagues, veterans, and local business owners. So these all serve as potential trusted local messengers that you could utilize. However, we can appreciate that it can be really challenging to amplify local voices on a national scale. So we'll go to the next slide. When you're thinking about how to engage a national audience, in-group messengers, so individuals who share the same beliefs, values, perspectives, and experiences as your target audience are a really invaluable resource. So in 2023, More in Common tested 4 different interventions to help correct some of the perception gaps Paul mentioned earlier in the presentation, as well as to reduce levels of partisan animosity. So the most effective strategy we tested was a video that featured both out-group testimony and in-group reactions. So for example, we showed Democrats a video of Don, who's a young Republican from Texas, sharing his views on teaching US history in a way that really challenged dominant stereotypes. Participants then watched Cheryl, who's a Democrat from Michigan, react with surprise at Don's answers and reconsider her own assumptions or views on Republicans. Immediately after watching this brief video, viewers showed a decline in levels of partisan animosity. So I think one of the key takeaways from this study is just the power of in-group messengers. So for Democrats, watching Cheryl react with surprise and then genuinely question her own assumptions or views about Republicans encouraged other Democrats to do the same and almost gave them permission to do that. People are much more open to bridging divides when they see others they identify with doing so. So as communicators, you all play such a vital role in amplifying these stories of in-group messengers who are modeling the behaviors that we really want to encourage. We can go to the next slide. So lifting up the voices and the actions of local leaders and trusted in-group messengers is really powerful, I think, because it has the potential to help us establish or reinforce healthy social norms. So those are the standards that help define desirable behavior in a community. So in a recent study, we found that the more people think others in their community are connecting across lines of difference, the more normal that behavior seems, and the more interested and willing they are to connect as well. So to put it another way, the more that people perceive that their neighbors or that other parents at their kids' schools are spending time with people who are different than them, whether that's from a different race, political ideology, social economic status, etc., the more it becomes embedded in the culture and sets an expectation that this is just something that we do. This is new research that we haven't published yet, but wanted to share it today because I think it serves as a helpful reminder that you all as communicators play such a vital role in elevating narratives that are helping to shape and then reinforce these healthier social norms that we're trying to promote. So the research will be coming out in a couple months, and as we continue to do our analysis and sense making, really excited to work with you all to think about some of the potential implications for your work. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to share just a few quick words on mediums, Overall, Americans are open to many different formats for delivering messages about bridging political divides, from speeches to commercials to documentaries to social media campaigns to town halls. They want it all, the more, the better. However, they really prioritize the tone and the content. So they expressed a preference for messaging that emphasizes shared identities, common goals and values, and that's respectful and factual in tone, which I think Carolyn is going to share two beautiful case studies that help show some of those skills in action. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to take just the last 1 or 2 minutes to share a few slides highlighting Americans' perceptions of philanthropy to help better kind of situate where you live in the public's trust and imagination. With the caveat that we ran a brief survey in preparation for this presentation, where we asked our online panel of 200 Americans a few questions about their views towards philanthropy. So I just want to note that these findings aren't statistically significant as the sample size is small, but I think help elevate some interesting perspectives and insights that are worth considering. We can jump to the next slide. So first and foremost, philanthropy. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I imagine you all know this. Philanthropy isn't top of mind for the average American. When we asked, what do you think of when you think of philanthropy, who or what comes to mind? Responses really varied. So some people named individuals like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, Oprah Winfrey, as well as well-known charities like the Red Cross and Salvation Army. However, many couldn't name anyone or anything specific, indicating just a general gap in awareness or knowledge. They spoke in more general terms about donating money or supporting a cause that you care about. We can jump to the next slide. We did find that a majority of Americans, 57%, believe that donations are making a significant difference in societal issues. However, about 4 in 10 think philanthropy wields too much influence and serves as a tool for the rich. We can jump to the next slide. We also asked about perceptions of bias in philanthropy. And while many Americans in the study acknowledged bias in philanthropic institutions, interestingly, they didn't always view it negatively. Many believe that bias is inevitable since institutions are run by people with their own beliefs and priorities. However, there were some respondents that were a bit more skeptical, suggesting that organizations might have hidden agendas or self-serving motives. And then lastly, when we can jump to the final slide. When we asked what would increase trust and engagement with philanthropic institutions, over 7 in 10 Americans cited greater transparency. I think the most interesting thing to come from this question was that there was less interest in hearing personal stories from beneficiaries, which I know is a common strategy. Again, with the caveat that the sample size is small, but just that's interesting to consider or think about as you develop your own messaging. So I'll pause there and very excited to pass it off to Carolyn, who is going to share 2 really compelling case studies of messaging for public good.
Thank you so much, Julia. Hello, everyone. I'm Carolyn Cooper. I'm Vice President of Research and Impact with Neiman Collaborative. I'm really excited to be here with you all today and to be on this panel talking about this important topic and sharing some of our work. We are a team of strategists dedicated to making change happen, and we do that by using research to find breakthrough messages and strategies that bring people together for impact. We support clients in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors as well as the government, and our founder, Rich Niemand, is a pioneer in social impact marketing, but we are now a woman-owned small business led by our president, Sarah Hutchinson. Next slide, please. So we've seen a lot of great data today on polarization and how we can bridge divides. At Neiman Collaborative, we also use data to bridge gaps and bring people together. And I'm using 2 very different case studies to show how we use data to find commonalities and close those gaps. This first case study tells how we were able to help win greater support for bike infrastructure among bikers and non-bikers through a unifying message. Next slide, please. So here is the challenge that we were facing. A philanthropy group, When Collective, wanted to encourage alternatives to driving, particularly to lower the carbon footprint by increasing bike riding. But data showed that really safe lanes, bike lanes where bikers were protected, would increase biking for everyday things like commuting, shopping, you name it. They wanted to do this with a focus on equity and had been successful in a pilot city, Denver, but wanted to increase bike infrastructure in several other major cities that weren't particularly bike-friendly or liberal. Los Angeles, New Orleans, Austin. Next slide, please. This chart shows the results of survey research asking about support for bike infrastructure. On the left side of the slide, we see that 62% of the total were likely to support bike infrastructure investments in their city. But the percent that were extremely likely, or that top box score, was only 19%. So really lacking in intensity. And this was our starting point. Support was great, but not particularly strong. Next slide, please. This chart shows the percentage of people that agree with one of several messages that we tested based on what we learned in qualitative research conducted in all of the targeted cities. 84% agree with the statement, "I would support improved bike infrastructure if we could also get other improvements such as better roads and parking." The research helped us identify that we gain greater support for bike infrastructure when bike infrastructure is put within the context of overall mobility, how people can get around in general. Next slide, please. So understanding our baseline of support, we went on to conduct more research to identify and understand the commonalities between bikers and drivers. Our research approach is based on the means and theory of decision-making. We use qualitative and quantitative to create pathways of decision-making or decision maps based on what people value most. We've heard about that from the other panelists. And then we translated that research into a message frame that was used to train advocates on how to talk to people to bridge the divide and garner more voter support. Next slide, please. Okay, so we began thinking about how we could shift the conversation. The data showed us that people want accountability for cars and bikers. This chart shows people's level of agreement with a series of messaging statements about bike infrastructure. The most agreeable statement is that bikers need to adhere to the rules of the road and to be held accountable for breaking those rules in the same way as drivers. Followed by, all bikers and drivers should be required to have basic education on how to share the road. Next slide, please. So these top two statements, bikers need to adhere to the rules of the road and be accountable for breaking the rules the same as drivers, and bikers and drivers should be required to have basic education on sharing the road, captured sentiment about bike infrastructure. It was needed on both sides, for bikers and drivers. What we found is that the thing that was assumed to be creating the polarization, bike infrastructure, was exactly the thing that would solve all problems. If we had better infrastructure, it would help drivers drive and bikers bike, and that's what would bring them together. Next slide, please. So research revealed that the key to winning public support is to create a unifying message that shows how bike infrastructure works to the benefit of everyone, bikers, drivers, and walkers. Next slide, please. Our value proposition and unifying message is everyone gets peace on the road when everyone has a piece of the road. This accompanying visual brings that to life by showing the dedicated lanes for everybody, walkers, bikers, and drivers. And over to the right is our message narrative. I'm not going to read that to you, but I'll show you this in bullets in the next slide. We were able, so our message frame is here, and this is how we break down our narrative in a more succinct way. And this is part of what we use to train advocates to stop bikers from being at war with people with cars. Everyone has peace on the road when everyone has a piece of the road. Drivers, walkers, and bikers can get where they are going with the greatest safety and the least amount of hassle, because everyone's traffic flow needs are met through careful planning and smart construction. Bike infrastructure helps us move forward together by relieving traffic congestion and increasing mobility. So really tying together some of those themes that emerge in those earlier rounds of research. Next slide, please. So here's our impact. We were able to increase support among voters, both bikers and non-bikers, for investments in bike infrastructure. And most recently, the strategy resulting from this research and messaging is delivering about $9 in public investment for every $1 of philanthropic investment. That's just furthering miles of protected bike lanes and infrastructure improvements in some of the most car-centric and congested cities in the US. Next slide, please. So in the bike infrastructure example, we had to find commonalities with two groups that seemed at odds with each other and resolve long-standing conflict. Who owns the road? This next example is not about long-standing conflict, but it is about building trust in a community where there was long-standing mistrust. We did this work on behalf of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services during the COVID-19 pandemic as part of their public communications campaign. Next slide, thank you. So here's where we started. As you all remember, there were a lot of challenges across the United States during the pandemic, especially those early days, that were not limited to the Hispanic community. We were all dealing with just stress, pandemic stress. Vaccine had come out really quickly, so there was a lot of hesitancy around it and politicalization. And there was also mistrust in the medical system. Because of how rapidly things were evolving and just the amount of information and conflicting information at times that were coming out and being thrown at us. But these issues, back up just a little bit, thank you. But these issues were compounded for people in the Hispanic community who were also facing language barriers, cultural differences, and for some fear and concern that interactions with the medical system could lead to their immigration status or that of their family being challenged or flagged. So in this instance, it was not the message that needed to change for different communities. The message and approach was the same for everyone. Like I said, we were all dealing with these issues. The difference was the messenger. And that kind of goes back to a lot of what Julia shared, that trusted messenger component. So that's where we focus to build trust. Next slide, please. This graphic points to the power of having materials and information readily available in Spanish. We asked folks that if provided with Spanish language COVID-19 vaccine materials, what that would do to them, for them, and 81% strongly agreed that materials would allow them to share up-to-date information with their community. 73% strongly agreed that community members were more likely to get vaccinated if they had Spanish language COVID-19 vaccine materials available. So that's where we focus. Next slide, please. We began by creating culturally and linguistically appropriate materials. We focused on transcreation, not translation or machine translation. And I have to really give a shout out to my colleague, Jennifer Guzman, who's really the leader of this on our team. We were able to engage native Spanish language speakers and communications partners to support that transcreation. And to do that, we had to build Spanish content development into our communications timelines, being real intentional about making sure that we not only dedicated resources, but also the time needed to ensure that that transcreation was done appropriately and properly. Next slide, please. So here are examples of some of the materials that we created. On the left, we have a flyer that we created with a North Carolina-based community partner, Healthier Communities, that did outreach in Hispanic communities. And this was created to share the most current information about who was eligible for the vaccine, its effectiveness, and that it was free, and to direct people to vaccine resources. In the middle, this flyer was created to encourage people to have a healthier summer by encouraging them to get the most up-to-date vaccines before engaging in all of the summer fun. And on the right, we have a flyer that directs people to the NCDHHS COVID-19 website and call center. Next slide, please. To make sure that our materials got to their intended audience, we build and maintain trust and partnerships with the community. To do that, we prioritize partnering with community-based organizations. I referenced one in the previous slide, as well as those local community leaders that Julia mentioned and other trusted messengers. We were transparent and collaborative and really clear about what we knew and what we didn't know. And then we also shared updates and asked for feedback of these community leaders and partners feedback on our materials, feedback on our dissemination plans and strategies. And we also solicited input about the needs that the community has so that we could lift those up in our language and in our content. And we also welcomed their participation in our events and asked to be included in their events as well. And this was also that we could ensure that our content reflected the latest information and directly addressed the concerns and needs of the Hispanic community. Next slide, please. Okay, so key to doing all of that was treating the Spanish language website and content with the same attention as the English version. This website, vacunate.nc.gov, became a central hub of information and resources in North Carolina. And it served an estimated 720,000 Spanish-speaking North Carolinians, but it also became a global source of information, and several years into the pandemic indexes really highly on Google for content related to vaccines. More than 1.7 million Spanish language users came from outside of North Carolina to visit that site. Next slide, please. I appreciate all of the hearts. Okay, and so to build trust, we also made sure to reach people where they are. In the early days of the pandemic, we made sure that our communications team was in regular communication with the operations team to understand things like vaccine supply in the state, so that we weren't supporting or promoting supports that and resources that were in limited supply or that just simply weren't available. If we heard about people in areas without access to vaccines, we shared that with the operations folks so that mobile vaccine clinics could be deployed in those areas. We also invited community partners and trusted messengers to participate in our events, and also we had a presence at theirs. Next slide, please. One example of having a presence is through the 15 virtual cafecitos, which are also like just tele-town halls that we hosted, where we invited trusted messengers from the community, as well as from within the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, to discuss timely pandemic-related topics and to share resources. We had over 75,000 participants, and 71,000 more watched the recordings online that were posted on social media after these events. So in total, we reached over 146,000 people with these 15 virtual cafecitos. Thank you. Next slide. And here's our impact. There was zero vaccination gap between Hispanic and non-Hispanic North Carolinians getting their first 2 vaccines. More people who identified as Hispanic were vaccinated than non-Hispanic in the state of North Carolina. So really proud of this concerted group effort. I'm one person representing our team, but there is a whole host of folks, our Neiman Collaborative and our partners, that contributed to this success. And so this is really my last slide, but I just want to say that as we think about closing gaps, it's important to remember that communities are made up of individuals. And when we are working on a campaign, it comes down to individual decision-making and what individuals value, as we heard from the other panelists. In our bike example, it was, can I get to work on time so that I can provide for my family? Can me and my kids get around my community safely, walking, biking, or driving? In the case of vaccines, it was, who can I trust for this information? So that's what we do at Neiman. We hone in on what matters to those individuals and real people and communities. And what our decades of experience tells us is that we do have more in common than we think, and it's more productive to start from that place, what people value, what motivates them, and what they care about. Thank you so much. I think I turn it over to Phoebe now.
Thank you, Carolyn, for those fantastic case studies and that really helpful practical application. We started this call by identifying issues that are polarizing our communities and workplaces, everything from immigration to affordable housing to the national election. And our hope is that over the course of this panel, you feel more equipped through research and case studies to address polarization, both in your organizations and also in your individual lives. We learned from More in Common that we are less divided than we think we are, even in an election year, that American political parties, while they have become more ideological and separated across identity lines, there's also something called the perception gap. There's a difference between what one group thinks another group believes and what the other group actually believes. And this perception gap is larger than the actual gap. Tone is important. Next slide. In the research that Julia shared, people said that they care about the tone of content more than the medium. They want content that uplifts shared identities and the common good. And within the framework of bridge building, thinking back to that XY axis, our goal should be to move people toward a moderated tone and temperament, away from volatility or apathy. Next slide. And building trust matters. We're living in a low trust era. This extends to most of our core institutions, including government, corporations, philanthropy, and the media. People generally trust local community members more than national figures. And Carolyn's case study showed what it looks like to develop relationships with trusted messengers in local contexts to achieve goals like building bike infrastructure and increasing COVID vaccination rates. Time and time again, bridge building efforts have showed that one-on-one conversations tend to prove more effective in changing perceptions and stances more than media campaigns. But one way to emulate the sense of community is through trusted in-group messengers. When people see members of their own group reconsider their views, this makes people more likely to reconsider their own. And so with all of that said, summarizing a lot of content over the last hour, we want to leave you with just 3 key takeaways. Next slide, please. We can protect against feeding into the perception gap by being careful about making assumptions and using labels. Let's get curious. Let's do the research, ask questions, listen to understand, and then appeal to values. And finally, seek to build a unifying message by finding common ground, building and maintaining trust with community partners, and emphasizing the benefit to everyone. Thank you all for sticking with us through this webinar. We're grateful for your investment, your time investment in this conversation. We're looking forward to the discussion that comes after this, and we are grateful for the Communications Network for hosting us today. Thank you all.